Is this microphone live also? I think that's what they call these things. After, for the program a little bit for you folks, after my comments, Chris Helzer from the Nature Conservancy will share some comments, perhaps a rebuttal to my address, which is entitled Why We Should Plant Trees. And then we'll take some questions from the audience. As Chancellor of the University of Nebraska in the year 1902, I'm happy to welcome this group of eminent biologists. I've been Chancellor 3 times here at the university. They keep coming to me when they need an interim Chancellor, and they pull me out of the classroom. I'm excited about a lot of things this year. A slight correction over my introduction. In the year 1902, this is the 30th anniversary of Arbor Day, which was started here in Nebraska by our great Governor J. Sterling Morton. There's festivities going on over at Nebraska City today. In the year 1902, at the beginning of a new century, I'm also very excited about the prospects for our university here. We, in the last 2 decades, have built one of the premier public research universities in the country. If we maintain our target, we maintain our sights on academics, and we don't get distracted by athletics and other things, I'm sure 100 years from now, we will again say the University of Nebraska is one of the top 5 public universities in this country. I'm also excited about my students, my graduate students, the new directions they're taking us in. We've had a number of excellent students in our botanical seminar over the last 10 years. In particular, I should mention one of our Lincoln hometown boys, Frederick Clements. He did both his undergraduate and his graduate degrees with me, just finished recently. I'm sure he's going to have a large impact on this new field of ecology that we're so excited about here in Nebraska. I'm also excited about the revolutions going on in biology. How we think about it, how we study it, how we teach it. Just recently I had a chat with one of my neighbors here in Lincoln, William Jennings Bryant. As you may recall, he lost the presidential race just 2 years ago. He's a little recalcitrant to my ideas on Darwinian approaches to biology, but I think he'll come around. I'm optimistic that within a decade or 2 this creationism business will pass along and we will be in a modern approach to biology. Finally, I'm excited about trees. Just last month, President Roosevelt established 2 forest reserves in the Sandhills after, I guess, a fair amount of pestering by myself and others. This is a massive experiment we've begun to plant an entire forest landscape where no trees existed. So this has just started in the year 1902, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this in years to come. Before I give my main address, I just want to share a few things that I shared to this body 5 years ago in 1897 when I was really starting to advocate these experiments in the Sandhills about planting trees. So if I can quote from my earlier address, it may seem a visionary project to pose here seriously that a part of the great Sandhill area should be devoted to government forests. But there's no doubt that it is entirely a feasible project. We've been so accustomed in this country to cutting away forests that we're scarcely able to seriously think of growing forests or building up new forests. And in some ways the latter is more difficult than the former. If we've been such destroyers of forests, and this is a theme in my next address, our fathers and grandfathers reveled in the destruction of the eastern forests, that we do not regard it as a difficult thing to eradicate the trees from great areas. If Ohio has been changed from a solid forest area to one which is now almost a prairie within 75 years, it's unreasonable to think we could do the opposite in the Sandhills. Let us cease to think of the ease with which we destroy forests. Let us begin to think of the ease with which we might make forests. Let us urge upon this state the necessity of beginning to form large government forest preserves in the Sandhills region. Let us urge on the national government the desirability of having these national forests. That which seems now to many of us impossible will be found when we undertake this work seriously. We'll find that it can be accomplished. So I'm very proud of the success we've had lobbying in Washington in achieving this magnificent experiment of afforestation in the Sandhills. So my address I want to give to you today is entitled Why We Should Plant Trees on the occasion of Arbor Day. There are many veterans that have been fighting this battle for years. And I think that this army of people that plant trees needs to be constantly recruited. This is not a war with a time limit at all. And it will not do for us to say that Governor Furness or Governor Morton and a number of other honorable names, many of whom have ceased to be with us, it's not enough to say that they fought a good fight. We have millions of trees planted in this state, but we must continue this work and we must keep the recruiting office for this army open. One thing I rejoice is the fact that this Horticultural Society, which I'm addressing, has been a recruiting office for the enlistment of those who would plant trees, who would fight this battle. I was born in Ohio, 1841, in a state every acre of which, except the swampland, was covered with forest. What did we do? We cut down that great forest. We laugh at the people in the fable who killed the goose that laid the golden egg, and we say what silly fools they were. Yet in Ohio, we cut ruthlessly away that great eastern forest. I'm glad to say that personally I never cut many trees. I wasn't big enough or strong enough to be of much use in the timber industry, so I haven't many trees to blame myself for cutting. But they were cut, so that Ohio is now almost a prairie state. We think of what hard work it was to make Ohio and Michigan and Indiana and all these states eastward what they are now, great stretches of open country. We think of the people who gave their lives in the fight against the tree. And then when our predecessors came out here to the plains, in their view, they didn't have to get those miserable trees out of the way. We've learned that where trees are not, trees must be put. I've come to this conclusion that it will probably take just as much hard work to make a plains state like Nebraska a good state in which where people can spend their lives as it was to remove those trees in those other areas. It was killing work to cut the great trees and get rid of them. It's going to take as much work to put Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa and the Dakotas into the condition in which those states should be for our homes. We have to preach the crusade of filling up this state with trees, and to do that, we must plant trees and plant trees and plant trees. One of the prettiest sights I've seen in many years was when I came over to this meeting yesterday. I stopped at Mr. Aldrich's place, and as I came to the top of those swells, I looked off over the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trees that have already been planted in eastern Nebraska. This is not enough. Of course, many of those trees were already here, and many more have been planted, but it's not enough. As you go west in Nebraska, you will find the trees fewer and fewer until finally you will come to where trees are a rarity. 2 years ago, I took a run into the extreme western part of the state, and after several days in that exceedingly treeless country, I came back down on the Union Pacific Railway. The feeling that came to me as we came to larger and larger trees was the same as expressed by our returning soldiers. I was getting back into God's country. We must plant trees more than we have been planting. I think there has been a lull in the planting of trees in recent years. This is not as it should be. We must keep constantly planting trees. It seems to me that where a man has received 160 acres as a homestead allocation, one of his first duties should be to see that eventually 1/4 of that land is covered with great trees. Not simply scattered trees here and there, that's not enough. A solid block of trees or a few solid blocks of trees so that we can create those forest conditions. To organize my thoughts, I put down a few headings for why we should plant trees. First is shade. At the end of this week, I'm going to go back to western Nebraska, where I was 2 years ago. You can travel for hours without seeing anything in the way of shade. Just to give you a little idea of how shadeless that country is, I saw a few fence posts out there. And I actually saw lots and lots of grasshoppers gathered on the shady sides of those fence posts to get shade. Just imagine what human beings would feel like in a land where grasshoppers must hunt for shade such as that. One reason why this portion of Nebraska is so much better than that western part is that we have shade. but we do not have enough of it. Especially we need shade where the sun is as bright and constant as it is here. We college men notice some of these things more than others because we are obliged to. My attention was called a few years ago to the fact that we have so much more sunshine than they have even in our own country further east. Our professor of physics got his advanced degree at Cornell. He had lived with us so long that he was accustomed whenever he wanted a sunbeam to just put his heliostat out of the window and the sun would do the rest. When he got to Cornell, he wrote back that after he'd been there several months, calling attention to the fact that he was no longer living in a country where he could run to the window and catch a sunbeam whenever he wanted to. The percent of sunshine is very, very high in this region. We must have trees for shade, for ourselves, and for our animals. A second reason to plant trees is for protection. Frequently in this country you'll find a farmhouse standing by itself. The wind can blow from every direction and sweep around the corners of that house. The exception is the house that is well protected. Finally, you come to a few that are thoroughly protected by sheltering trees around them. It does not take many trees to deflect the wind. In its sweep, rasping over the surface, the wind is deflected up 50 or 60 feet and goes howling over the treetops without touching the house. So let us plant trees for protection. Third, let us plant trees for beauty. Travel back with me over that beautiful drive yesterday that I just mentioned. And I spoke of how those trees broke up that monotony of that skyline, what otherwise would have been a monotonous skyline. You people have lived here so long that you've forgotten the fact that the trees have added so much beauty to the eastern part of this state. This is a beautiful portion of this state. I think we are all agreed on that, and a large part of it is due to the fact that the skyline is constantly broken by these beautiful trees. You don't need to ask the question, what beautiful tree should I plant? Almost any tree, properly placed or properly massed with others, is beautiful. Okay. If I were a painter, I would like to paint you some of the pictures I have seen even within the last 24 hours. The way the foliage trails down from the trees to the shrubs, or the way it trails from the shrubs to the undershrubbery coming down, making lines that anyone, whether an artist or not, would have to admire. When you plant for beauty, having already planted for shade and protection, you can bring in interesting trees that you could not otherwise use. At Mr. Aldridge's beautiful place, I stood for 5 minutes looking at a ginkgo tree as tall as this room. If the other protecting trees had not been there, that tree would not have lived a single winter. So you can bring in even interesting trees into your grounds if you have the proper protection. Fourth, plant for wood. Yes, I do not see why we shouldn't burn wood. I was so delighted last evening when I drove into Mr. Aldridge's yard and finally went into the house to find the kitchen stove with wood in it. I was brought up where wood burned in the kitchen stove, and in the other stoves of the house for that matter. But now for years I've been compelled to burn nothing but soft, black, smutty coal. Let us grow trees enough so we'll have wood enough to burn in our kitchen stoves, if not in any other place in the house. We can get along with a hard coal burner if you're in the sitting room, but let's at least have wood enough so we can have a decent fire in the kitchen. Fifth, let's plan to conserve water. We had a great deal of wild talk in recent years when the rains kept getting more and more and more. We thought that by tree planting we were increasing the rainfall in the semi-arid West. Well, nature doesn't pay much attention to our little business transactions as far as her movements are concerned. We find that rainfall is just about as it was. You can't control that. But we can do one thing. We can use more of it so that when the rain does fall, it will not run away. There are few farms in the state of Nebraska, but have certain places where if 10, 15, 20-acre forest wasn't planted, the moisture would not be kept so that some distance away, lower down, springs would come out. Finally, plant trees. Do not simply plant 2 or 3. Plant them in blocks. Let us return to the old period that these veterans inaugurated years ago when tree planting was the rule for so many people in Nebraska. Let us plant trees. Let us be true to the name we have chosen for our state, the Tree Planters State. Plant for shade, plant for protection, plant for beauty, plant for wood, and plant for the conservation of moisture. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you, and I certainly appreciate the chance to follow such an eminent speaker, and I want to congratulate Dr. Bessey on his ability to speak at 160 years old. Many people when they reach their older age start to have problems remembering who they are, where they are, and things like that. But apparently, not a problem for Dr. Bessey. I'd like to start out by saying that Nebraska is a grassland state, as most of you might know. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes when you look out the window, but Nebraska is a grassland state. We've got many different types of grasslands, from short grass to tall grass, sandhills grasslands to loess hills grasslands to fairly deep soil grasslands. And they're not just diverse in type, but also diverse in their form and function. There are many different kinds of flowers, insects, mammals, birds that use these grasslands. Unfortunately, we've over the years lost most of the grasslands that are open enough that a northern harrier, for example, can glide across the landscape and not have to worry about bonking into a tree somewhere. There are a lot of reasons that we've lost the grasslands. One, of course, is that we've changed a lot of our landscape to farmland and to row crop agriculture. And I don't think that's necessarily such a bad thing. Nebraska is a really good place for agriculture. We've got a lot of areas that have good soils, they lay well for agriculture, and I don't have a problem with using those areas. Other areas that probably shouldn't be in row crop agriculture right now, but that's a whole other subject that other people are working on. But unfortunately, another reason that we've lost a lot of our grasslands is due to trees. And it started out with a fairly noble enough idea. We should plant trees around our houses, we should plant trees around our farms, we should plant trees around our livestock for shade, for protection, things like that. Now those are all noble ideas, but then we kind of quickly moved beyond that idea of using trees for their utilitarian value. And we started thinking about how nice it would be to have that familiar landscape that we and our ancestors were from, whether that was Ohio or England or other parts of Europe. And we got to the point where we were starting to plant trees in places where they really shouldn't be, and that they weren't any more appropriate than, say, a saguaro cactus. And at the same time, of course, we stopped fires that had kept the trees out of the rest of the state. And as soon as the fires stopped, people watched with sort of ambivalence and even enthusiasm as trees began to march into those once open landscapes. Native trees like eastern red cedar, ash, mulberry, locust started turning a lot of our open grasslands into weedy woodland wastelands. A lot of exotic trees like Siberian elms, Russian olives, Osage oranges escaped from where they had been planted with good intentions and started moving into areas and taking over and removing what was the grassland that was there. And because people had been told and taught that trees were universally good, and that you should plant trees, for example, people kept planting on one front, and at the same time ignoring the invasion of trees on the other front. And now we've lost our grassland landscape, we've lost most of our grassland wildlife, and probably most importantly, we've lost a heritage that was really important to Nebraska people, which is our grassland heritage. Now there are some of us who have recognized what's going on, and we've been cutting and mowing and burning trees as much as we can, but that's not enough. We need to cut more trees than we've been cutting, not just here or there, but in blocks, so that we can reestablish what was the once great grasslands of Nebraska. Now, to organize my thoughts, I've divided some reasons into different headings. First off, we should cut trees for livestock. It's amazing how many farmers in this state have to truck their cows hundreds of miles to find grass for them to eat. You cannot rent grass at any price in many parts of the state, so we should cut trees for livestock to establish forage for our cattle. Number two, we should cut trees for wildlife. Whether it's dick thistles or prairie chickens, ground squirrels, badgers, insects, even grasshoppers, all the other wildlife that use grasslands, and of course for the plant communities in the grasslands themselves, with all the flowers, sedges, grasses that are incorporated there. we should cut trees to reestablish the grasslands for wildlife. Third, we should cut trees for beauty, so that we can reestablish the serenity of the unobstructed view of the horizon, so that we can watch as the wind pushes a wave of grass from one side of the world to the other, and so that we can see the flowers that progress through the season from the early spring thaw all the way to the late fall frost. Cut trees for firewood. Cut trees for exercise. Cut trees for fun. Just cut trees. Hundreds and thousands of them. Dedicate all your free time to cutting trees. Let's get back to the good old days when the occasional shade tree was a good place to sit and watch the wind blow the grass. Thank you. Happy Arbor.
Chris. That was an interesting perspective. At this time, rather than us debating or literally fighting, we thought we would open this up and take a few questions if there was any in the audience. Or comments. Perhaps at the end of this little session we'll have a vote and we'll see which way this audience leans. Yes?
In terms of cutting trees for native diversity and then cutting trees for cows, so having more crops, there's sort of a conflict there.
Maybe. First of all, let me say right off that I'm not representing the Nature Conservancy in my comments today. I should probably make sure I say that to save my job. But I would say that where are you from, first of all?
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, yeah, I guessed. All I was going to say is that I think that there's, in the field of grassland management, there are some different thoughts as you go further east, in the tall grass prairie, for example. One of the things that, now my job with the Nature Conservancy is a land steward, and so I'm managing grasslands using fire and grazing, and the goal of my management is to manage them for plant diversity. And in the work that I do, grazing, I think, is probably the most effective tool I have to manage those grasslands for diversity. And the other thing, so that's one thing. And then the other thing is, and I should say that idea becomes a lot less common as you go farther east. You know, the eastern prairies, grazing is seen much less favorably, I think, by conservation groups. But the second thing is that if we don't keep the farmers who have cattle and the farmers who are farming in business in Nebraska, the alternative to that is sand and gravel mining and urban sprawl. And I would sure much rather have the first than the second.
Questions? Comments? At the far back?
Wasn't Nebraska one of the two incubators of grassland ecology studies? So it was a little surprising that Bessey would be so pro-tree and kind of forget about the grass temporarily.
Yeah, my students, Roscoe Pound, who later had an eminent career as a jurist, and he was a graduate student when Clements was an undergraduate, and they did some of the first botanical surveys in some of the northern western counties, the Arbor River Valley and parts of the Sandhills, and I don't know, I've talked to Frederick about that. And he seems, I don't know, maybe because he was born in Nebraska, raised in Lincoln, that this landscape seems to fit him better. More of a passion for grasslands than I would admit I have.
Although I'd also say that Dr. Bessey, I mean, had, in his career, had a lot of influence over grassland ecology. He was one of the first to really get people organized to inventory the grasslands of the state when he came, and a lot of the literature you see on things like blowout penstemon, a lot of the initial inventory, I think, was done by Dr. Bessey. So.
But we had to know where it was best to plant trees.
And so you picked the sandhills.
I heard there's an article in the Lincoln paper today about this 100th anniversary of the forest out in the middle of the Sandhills. You might want to take a look at that.
But don't go see the forest.
Other comments or questions? Yes, ma'am.
Does the forest they plant function as a forest?
A colleague of mine, Dave Wedin, could answer that differently than I do. He's doing quite a bit of research out there. And he would say that if you think of it as a forest, a closed canopy forest, it's rather pathetic. But if you think of how woody species naturally occur in the Great Plains, it is not at all unrepresentative of open structured savannas and woodlands. That's another, maybe there's a compromise in between those who want just grassland and those that want just forest. But I think it will take ecology a while to deal with grasslands and forests before they actually deal with more complex structured savannas and open woodlands. One of our Hungarian...
I don't buy into this new wave of what's called ecology or something, but maybe there is no real conflict here. I offer two potential questions regarding that. One is that aren't after all grass just miniature trees? maybe you would care to comment on that. And the other is that I talked to someone, although it's unconfirmed, that somewhere in the east, they actually can grow very little trees. I don't remember how they call them, bonsai or
I gave an address just 2 years ago at the American Academy of Science, which actually happened to be meeting in Toronto. That's true. And I gave an address on the need for incorporating a Darwinian approach and a more realistic phylogenetic approach to understanding plant diversity. And that was arguing against rather arbitrary ways of classifying plants. And what you seem to have proposed is a relatively arbitrary way of classifying plants. And I guess I still like to think of the Poaceae and the Pinaceae and see that diversity of plants. I'm not trying to lump them all together. So I guess a grass is not a tree in my
It's interesting, though, that you talk about arbitrary in terms of anything. But one of the things that seems to me that's interesting is, and this is in all seriousness, Nebraskans really do have an issue with trees. It's like Nebraskans have this idea that we're less good than other states because they have more trees than we have, and we're working as hard as we can to catch up with them. Instead of course, recognizing what we do have and the uniqueness of it. You might say we suffer from pinus envy.
And so, I think on that inspirational note, I guess I would like to take a query. We've had two very different views of the Nebraska landscape presented to you today. Two different visions of that landscape. And I'm curious in this audience, and the choices would be plant more trees or have fewer trees. How many of you think in Nebraska we should plant more trees? How many of you think in Nebraska that we perhaps need fewer trees? I can see defeat.